I never signed those papers. Then why is my name on them? I don't know. But someone wanted it there. Then you will keep quiet. Claire Morgan stopped outside the hospital elevator. Her brother's voice was still coming through the phone in her hand. Earlier, he had told her their father was sleeping after surgery. He had laughed when she promised to bring coffee. Claire had ended the call. Or thought she had. Now Daniel sounded nothing like the brother she knew. Cold, controlled, afraid. You saw what happened in that office, he said. And if Claire finds out before I fix this, everything Dad built is finished. A woman answered softly, I'm not trying to ruin your family. Claire recognized her. Mara Bennett, her father's nurse. Claire pressed herself against the wall as the elevator opened behind her. On the call, Daniel lowered his voice. Then forget what you saw. I can't. Silence. Then Mara said the sentence that made Claire stop breathing. Your father didn't sign away the company. Claire stared at the hospital doors. He was unconscious when someone used his hand. And suddenly, visiting her father was no longer the only reason she was there tonight. Claire did not move for several seconds. The hospital corridor continued around her as though nothing had happened. A nurse pushed a medication cart past. Somewhere behind the double doors, a monitor began beeping faster before settling again. The elevator closed, and through Claire's phone came only silence. The call had finally disconnected. She looked at Daniel's name on the screen. Her older brother, the person who had taught her to ride a bicycle, the person who had punched a boy in 8th grade for making her cry, the person who had stood beside her at their mother's funeral, with one arm around her shoulders and whispered, We still have Dad. We still have each other. Claire slipped the phone into her coat pocket. Then she walked toward room 814. Daniel was already there. Of course he was. He stood beside their father's bed wearing a navy suit with the jacket removed, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. A paper cup of coffee sat untouched on the windowsill. Thomas Morgan lay beneath a white blanket, oxygen tubing beneath his nose, his face gray with exhaustion. Daniel looked up when Claire entered. For one terrible second, she saw something in his expression, alarm. Then it disappeared. Finally, Claire forced herself to breathe normally. You said he was stable. He is. He doesn't look stable. He had a difficult afternoon. Daniel crossed the room and hugged her. Claire let him. That was harder than she expected. She could still hear his voice through the phone. Then forget what you saw. She stepped back. What happened? Complications after surgery. What kind? Blood pressure. Rhythm issues. They're monitoring him. Claire looked toward their father. Did he wake up? Briefly. Did he speak? Daniel hesitated. Not really. A tiny answer. A tiny pause. But Claire suddenly noticed pauses now. Who was here? Daniel frowned. What? Today. Who visited? Doctors. Nurses. Me. No one from the company? His eyes remained on hers. Why would anyone from the company come here? Claire shrugged. Dad practically lives there. He's unconscious, Claire. I know. Daniel picked up his coffee. He didn't drink it. Then he said, You look strange. I've been traveling for 5 hours. No. Something else. She smiled. Maybe I'm worried about my father. Daniel studied her for another moment. Claire wondered whether he could hear her heartbeat. Then their father's fingers moved. Both of them turned. Thomas's eyes opened slowly. Dad? Claire reached the bed first. His gaze found her. For a moment, confusion, then recognition. Claire, her throat tightened. I'm here. His eyes moved toward Daniel. Something changed. Not fear exactly. Urgency. Thomas tried to lift himself. Daniel reached immediately for the bed controls. Dad, don't. Thomas ignored him. Claire, I'm listening. His voice was barely audible. Office. Daniel went still. What office? Claire asked. Thomas's breathing became uneven. The red. His eyes closed. Dad? The red what? Daniel pressed the nurse call button. Claire, stop. He's trying to tell me something. He just came out of surgery. Thomas's fingers tightened weakly around Claire's wrist. Red file. Claire stared at him, then at Daniel. Daniel's face had changed, only slightly, but enough. What red file? She asked. Claire. She turned. Her brother's voice was controlled again. Not now. The nurse entered. Then another. Claire was moved away from the bed while they checked Thomas's monitors. Daniel stepped into the hallway. Claire followed. The moment the door closed, he turned toward her. Don't interrogate him again. I asked one question. He nearly coded yesterday. And somehow, red file made you nervous. Daniel's expression hardened. What is that supposed to mean? Nothing. Then don't say it like it means something. Claire held his gaze. 10 years earlier, she would have backed down. 5 years earlier, probably 2. Daniel had always been the louder Morgan child. The certain one. The future president. Claire had spent most of her adult life running the family's charitable foundation, partly because she loved the work, and partly because Morgan Holdings had never seemed large enough for both Thomas Morgan and Daniel Morgan's personalities. She had learned how to survive them by stepping sideways. Tonight she didn't. What happened in Dad's office, Daniel? Silence. There. Again. That tiny pause. Then, I don't know what you're talking about. Claire nodded. Okay. She walked away. Daniel called after her. Claire. She stopped. Where are you going? To get coffee. At midnight. Yes. There is coffee here. She looked at the untouched cup in his hand. So I see. Then she left. Mara Bennett was sitting alone in the nurse's cafeteria. Claire recognized her immediately. 32, maybe 33. Dark hair pulled back. Blue scrubs. No makeup except what looked like the remains of mascara after a very long shift. She was stirring tea she wasn't drinking. Claire sat opposite her. Mara looked up and went pale. You're Claire Morgan. Yes. Mara's eyes moved toward the door. I should get back upstairs. Please don't. I really do have patience. My brother doesn't know I'm here. That stopped her. Claire lowered her voice. And he doesn't know I heard the phone call. Mara's spoon slipped against the ceramic cup. Neither woman spoke. Finally Mara whispered, How much? Enough. Claire, I heard you say my father was unconscious when someone used his hand. Mara closed her eyes. Oh God. I need you to tell me exactly what that means. I can't. Because Daniel threatened you? Mara looked at her sharply. He didn't threaten me. He told you to forget what you saw. That isn't the same thing. It sounded close. Mara looked around again. Claire leaned forward. I'm not asking you to accuse anyone. I'm asking you to tell me what happened to my father. Mara's expression changed. That is why I didn't say anything. What? Because I don't know if what happened is connected to his medical condition. Claire felt cold. What are you saying? I'm saying I saw something I should not have seen. That's all I know. Tell me. Mara took a breath. 2 nights ago, your father was sedated after the procedure. Claire nodded. He wasn't fully unconscious every second, but he wasn't competent to consent to anything complicated. What happened? A man arrived after visiting hours. Who? I don't know his name. Describe him. Late 50s. Gray hair. Expensive suit. Gold-framed glasses. Claire immediately knew. Stephen Vale. Mara's eyes narrowed. Who? Our family attorney. I don't know. Maybe. What did he do? Mara looked down at her hands. He brought papers. Claire's stomach tightened. Daniel was with him. Yes. What kind of papers? I couldn't see everything. Then what did you see? Mara swallowed. A signature page. Claire waited. Your father wasn't awake enough to sign. So what happened? Mr. Vale said they could use biometric authorization. Claire stared. My father hates electronic signatures. I didn't know that. What happened next? Mara's voice dropped. Daniel held his hand. Claire stopped breathing, and Vale pressed your father's thumb against a small scanner. Silence. The cafeteria refrigerator hummed behind them. Claire's voice came out thin. My father was sedated. Yes. And they used his fingerprint. Yes. For what? I don't know. You must have seen something. One line. What line? Mara looked directly at her. Transfer of controlling interest. Claire sat back. The room seemed to shift. Morgan Holdings was worth hundreds of millions. Controlling interest wasn't paperwork. It was ownership. Transfer to whom? I couldn't see. Daniel? I don't know. Vale? I don't know. Mara? I truly don't. Claire stood. Then sat again because her knees had suddenly lost confidence. Why didn't you report it? I did. Claire stared. To whom? The supervising administrator. And? He told me it was a family matter. A family matter? He said your brother held medical power of attorney. He does. Then he said maybe there were provisions allowing him to handle financial matters too. There aren't. Mara's face tightened. You're certain? I drafted the revisions with Dad 2 years ago. Medical authority is Daniel's. Corporate authority stays with Dad unless the board invokes incapacity procedures. Mara said nothing. Claire understood what that meant. Whatever document Daniel and Stephen Vale had executed, they hadn't simply taken advantage of a gray area. They had gone around the rules entirely. Then Mara reached into her scrub pocket. I shouldn't have this. She placed her phone on the table. Claire looked down. A photograph, slightly crooked, taken from a distance. Daniel beside the bed. Stephen Vale leaning over Thomas. A small biometric scanner against Thomas Morgan's hand. And in the lower corner, half a document. Claire enlarged it, most of the words blurred, but one company name remained readable. Halcyon Strategic Partners. Claire's blood went cold. She knew the name, not because she had ever done business with them, because her father hated them. Halcyon had tried to acquire Morgan Holdings 3 years earlier. Thomas had rejected them publicly, called their methods predatory. Send this to me. Mara shook her head immediately. No, Mara. I took it because something felt wrong. I didn't take it to become part of a corporate war. My father may have had control of his company transferred while he was sedated. I know. Then help me. Mara's eyes filled. You think I don't want to? Claire went quiet. Mara continued. I have spent 8 years building my nursing career. I have student loans. My mother lives with me. One complaint from a family like yours, and I can spend the next year defending myself against people who can afford to make the process hurt. Claire looked at her, not as a witness, as a woman calculating whether truth was something she could financially survive. Claire lowered her voice. I won't ask you to give me the photograph. Mara looked surprised. But don't delete it. I wasn't planning to. And don't confront Daniel. Mara laughed once, without humor. I've learned that lesson. Claire stood. One more question. Mara waited. Why was Daniel talking to you tonight? Because he found out I'd asked medical records whether your father was lucid at the time the authorization happened. Claire froze. That's why he called? Yes. What exactly did he say? That I was misunderstanding something complicated. That everything was being done to protect your father. And do you believe him? Mara looked toward the cafeteria window. I think people can do terrible things while calling them protection. At 7 o'clock the next morning, Claire entered Morgan Holdings headquarters. She hadn't been there before sunrise in years. The security guard looked surprised. Ms. Morgan? Morning, Paul. Everything okay? No. She smiled faintly. But thank you for asking. The elevator carried her to the executive floor. Her father's office was locked. Claire entered the 6-digit code. Rejected. She tried again. Rejected. Thomas hadn't changed that code in 11 years. Her birthday. stared at the keypad. Then she went to the executive assistant's desk. Empty. One drawer was locked. Another wasn't. Inside was a small brass key labeled Archive. Claire almost laughed. Her father had spent 40 years building a corporation protected by biometric scanners, encrypted servers, and multi-million-dollar security systems, and still labeled keys. She loved him for it. The archive room sat behind the executive conference room. Inside were shelves of contracts, board books, property documents, and old acquisition files. Claire searched for almost 40 minutes. Nothing read. Then she remembered what her father had actually said. Not archive, not contract. Office. She returned to his office. The code had been changed, but Claire knew another way in. Her father had designed the executive floor himself. When she was 12, he'd shown her the hidden connecting door between his office and the private conference room because he thought secret doors were hilarious. She entered through the conference room. It was still there, hidden behind walnut paneling. Inside Thomas's office, nothing looked disturbed. Desk, leather chairs, photographs, her mother's portrait near the window. Claire touched the frame. "Help me out here, Mom." Silence. Then she noticed the bookcase. One red spine. Not a file. A binder. She pulled it free. Behind it was a small wall safe. Claire stared. Of course. The safe required a code. She tried her mother's birthday. Nothing. Their wedding anniversary. Nothing. Then Claire thought about Thomas. His favorite joke about security. People choose codes based on what they don't want to forget. She entered the date Claire and Daniel's mother had died. The lock clicked. Claire closed her eyes. Dad. Inside were 3 things: a sealed envelope with Claire's name, a USB drive, and a red file. Her hands began to shake. She opened the file first. The first page was labeled Confidential, Internal Review. The second, Halcyon Strategic Partners. Then names: Stephen Vale, 2 board members, and Daniel Morgan. Claire sat down. She read for 20 minutes, then reread it, because the first time her emotions had swallowed half the words. Her father had been investigating a coordinated attempt to depress Morgan Holdings' value, manufactured supplier disputes, deliberately delayed contracts, a false liquidity panic, internal leaks. Someone wanted the board frightened enough to accept Halcyon's acquisition offer. And according to Thomas's notes, information could only have come from inside the company. Stephen Vale was suspected. Daniel was listed differently, not as perpetrator, as possibly compromised, unwitting participant. Claire stared at that sentence. Unwitting. Her brother might not have begun this as a traitor. But what had he become? She opened the envelope. Her father's handwriting. Claire, if you're reading this because I gave it to you myself, then I'm sorry for frightening you. If you're reading it because I couldn't, then listen carefully. She stopped. Her throat tightened, then continued. Daniel believes the company is in greater danger than it is. Someone has been feeding him selected information for months. I tried to make him see the pattern, but he thinks I am refusing to adapt because I'm old. Maybe I am old. I am also not stupid. Claire almost smiled. That was her father. Even in a secret letter. Stephen Vale has been working with Halcyon. I believe he has at least 2 members of our board. Daniel is the door they are trying to walk through. Claire's hand tightened around the paper. Your brother wants to save this company. That is exactly why he is vulnerable. Fear makes good people rush, and rushed people sign things they would normally read twice. Then, if anything happens to me before I confront this, do not assume Daniel is innocent, but do not assume he understood everything either. Find out which is true before you decide what he deserves. Claire lowered the letter. Her father knew. He knew something was coming. A sound came from the outer office. Claire froze. Footsteps. She closed the file. Someone entered. Daniel. Claire had seconds. She returned everything to the safe except the USB drive. slid it into her coat pocket, and closed the panel. Then she stepped through the hidden door. "Claire?" She stopped. Too late. Daniel stood in the office, his face unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Claire turned. "Looking for Dad's insurance documents." "At 7:30 in the morning?" the hospital asked. "They would call me." Maybe they called his daughter. Daniel's eyes moved around the room, then landed on the bookcase. Claire watched him notice the red binder was slightly crooked. He walked toward it, straightened it, then looked at her. "You were in the safe." Not a question. Claire said nothing. Daniel laughed quietly. "Dad told you. He tried. What did you find? What did you sign?" Silence. There it was. No more pretending. Daniel closed the office door. "You don't understand what's happening." "Then explain it." "The company is weeks away from a liquidity crisis." "No, it isn't." His expression changed. Claire continued. "You were shown selected numbers. You've been here 15 minutes. And I've seen enough to know Dad thought Stephen Vale was manipulating you." Daniel's jaw tightened. Dad thought everyone who disagreed with him was manipulating someone. He specifically named Halcyon. That landed. Daniel turned away. Claire watched his shoulders. "Did you know?" "No." "Did you know the documents transferred controlling interest?" Daniel said nothing. "Daniel, they were temporary." Claire stared. "What does that mean?" "Bridge authority. Halcyon was going to inject capital. We buy back the voting shares after 12 months. You used Dad's fingerprint while he was sedated." Daniel turned. "He would have signed." "You don't know that. He had already agreed the company needed protection. Not Halcyon. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore." Claire's anger rose. "He was thinking clearly enough to investigate the man standing beside you." Daniel stepped closer. "You think I wanted this?" "I don't know what you wanted. I wanted to stop 6,000 employees waking up to discover their jobs were gone because our father was too proud to admit the company needed help." "Was that Stephen's argument?" "It was mine." "Was it?" Daniel's face hardened. Claire pulled the photograph up on her phone. The one Mara had sent after all, 15 minutes earlier with 4 words. "Use it carefully. Please." Daniel looked at the image. All the color left his face. "Where did you get that?" "Does it matter?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because that nurse doesn't understand what she saw. Mara understands unconscious." Daniel closed his eyes. "Claire, you threatened her. I told her to stay out of it. You told her to forget. Because Stephen said if the authorization was challenged before funding cleared, Halcyon could walk." Claire stared. "And you believed him?" "Yes." "Do you still?" Daniel didn't answer. For the first time since the hallway, Claire saw something other than defensiveness. Fear. Real fear. Daniel. He sat in their father's chair. It looked wrong. He ran both hands over his face. "Stephen told me the company had 14 days. For what? Payroll covenant breach. That isn't true. I saw the reports." "Reports he gave you?" Daniel looked up. Claire watched understanding begin. Not arrive completely, but begin. Oh God. She took the USB drive from her pocket. "Dad left this." Daniel stared. "Have you opened it?" "No." "Why?" "Because I wanted you here when I did." He looked at her. "Why?" Claire thought about their father's letter. "Find out which is true before you decide what he deserves." "Because Dad wasn't sure whether you betrayed him." Daniel flinched. "Or whether someone used your fear." The USB contained 47 files. They opened it in the private conference room. Emails, bank reconciliations, board communications, screenshots, audio recordings. Their father had built the case carefully. By file 19, Daniel stopped speaking. By file 31, he looked physically ill. Stephen Vale had created the liquidity crisis, not alone. One board member delayed a major refinancing vote. Another redirected a supplier dispute into litigation. Stephen fed Daniel internal forecasts that excluded 2 major incoming payments. Halcyon had then appeared with a rescue package. A rescue to a fire they had helped start. Then they opened file 42. An audio recording. Stephen's voice. Daniel is easier than Thomas, because Daniel needs to be the man who saves the building. Another voice laughed. Does he suspect? No. He thinks this was his idea. Daniel stood abruptly. Claire stopped the recording. Her brother walked to the window. Chicago stretched beneath him. 40 floors of glass. The company they had grown up inside. Their father's life. Their mother's absence. Everything suddenly rearranged. Claire approached slowly. Daniel. He shook his head. I used Dad's hand. Yes. I know what you thought. No. He turned. His eyes were wet. You don't. Claire waited. Daniel's voice broke. I thought if he died, and I let the company die too, then I would have failed him twice. That took some of her anger with it. Not all, but some. You still crossed a line. I know. You threatened Mara. I know. You could have destroyed her career because she saw something you were ashamed of. Daniel looked down. I know. And knowing now doesn't erase that. I know. Claire stared at him. For once he didn't defend himself. No explanation, no strategy, just, I know. Then he said, What do we do? Claire looked at the evidence. Nothing. Daniel blinked. What? We let Stephen believe you still trust him. At 10:15, Daniel called Stephen Vale. Claire sat across the table listening. Daniel's voice was perfect. Controlled. Urgent. Exactly as Stephen expected. The authorization went through? It did, Stephen said. And Halcyon? Prepared to move. My father woke up briefly. Pause. What did he say? Nothing useful. Claire watched Daniel. Even over the speaker, she could hear Stephen relax. Daniel continued. Claire's here. Another pause. Does she know anything? No. Claire almost smiled. Stephen said, Keep it that way. Daniel's eyes met hers. What happens next? Emergency board meeting tomorrow. We formalize the transfer. Once that's done, your father can't reverse it even if he wakes up. Claire felt every muscle in her body tighten. Daniel didn't react. And Claire? She has no operational vote. What if she challenges? Stephen laughed softly. Then let her. The call ended. Daniel stared at the phone. He was my godfather. Claire looked at him. What? He held me at my baptism. I know. I called him after Mom died, because Dad wouldn't speak. Claire said nothing. He knew. Daniel's voice went quiet. He knew exactly what I was afraid of. Claire reached across the table. This time her brother took her hand. Then let's make him believe it worked. The emergency board meeting began the next morning at 9. Stephen Vale arrived at 8:17. Charcoal suit, gold-framed glasses, silver cufflinks. Claire noticed them immediately. So did Mara. She sat in a private security room 2 floors below with Claire's attorney and an independent compliance officer. Mara had nearly refused to come. Claire didn't blame her. You won't be asked to enter that boardroom unless you choose to. Claire had promised. Mara nodded. And my hospital? Your administration already has counsel's notice preserving your employment. I don't want special treatment. Neither do I. Claire looked at her. I want ordinary protection to actually work for an ordinary person. Mara studied her, then nodded. Upstairs, 14 board members sat around a long walnut table. Daniel took his father's chair. Claire sat along the wall. No vote. Exactly where Stephen wanted her. He barely acknowledged her. Given Thomas's incapacity, Stephen began, we are here to protect the stability of Morgan Holdings. Claire watched Daniel's hands. Steady. Stephen distributed folders. Halcyon Strategic Partners has agreed to provide emergency liquidity in exchange for temporary controlling interest. Temporary? One director asked. 12 months. Claire watched 2 members nod too quickly. the compromised ones. Stephen continued. Daniel has already executed the necessary interim authorization under emergency family authority. There. The lie. Claire let it breathe. A board member named Cynthia Reed frowned. Thomas signed? Stephen answered smoothly. Thomas authorized. Not the same words. Claire stood. Stephen looked irritated. Claire, this is a board proceeding. I know. You don't have voting authority. I know. Then please sit. I have one question. Daniel looked at Stephen. Let her ask. Stephen smiled. Of course. Claire walked toward the table. Was my father conscious when he authorized the transfer? Silence. Stephen answered first. He was medically competent. That's not what I asked. Claire, was he conscious? Stephen looked toward Daniel. Daniel said nothing. Claire continued. Because the hospital records say he was under procedural sedation. Stephen's smile disappeared. This is precisely why non-lawyers should not interpret medical documents. Good. Claire nodded toward the door. Then perhaps a lawyer should interpret the rest. The doors opened. Independent counsel entered. Then 2 forensic accountants. Then the company's outside compliance officer. Stephen went still. Claire placed a copy of the photograph on the table. The signature wasn't a signature. One director leaned forward. What is this? My father's biometric authorization being taken while he was sedated. Every head turned toward Daniel. He stood. I did it. A murmur moved around the table. Daniel continued. I held his hand. Stephen stared at him. Daniel. But I did it after Stephen Vale showed me falsified financial reports indicating the company was days from collapse. Stephen's face changed. Be very careful. I wish you'd given me that advice before you used me. Claire connected the USB drive to the conference screen. The liquidity crisis was manufactured. Files appeared. Emails. Payments. Board communications. One by one. The room changed. No longer skeptical. Afraid. Stephen stood. This meeting is over. No, Claire said. It actually just became useful. He turned toward the door. 2 investigators were standing outside. Not police. Not yet. Securities enforcement. Corporate crimes. People who didn't need dramatic speeches. Only evidence. Stephen looked toward Daniel. You think she's protecting you? Daniel's face tightened. She isn't. That surprised him. Daniel continued. I committed an unauthorized act using my father's biometric identity while he was incapacitated. I've already given a statement. Claire looked at her brother. They hadn't discussed exactly how he would phrase it. Daniel looked back. No hiding. No excuse. Stephen laughed. You'll destroy your career. Daniel nodded. Maybe. Then, but at least this time it'll be my consequence. The investigators entered. Stephen's composure finally cracked. You idiot. Do you understand what your father was doing? He was going to drive this company into the ground, protecting some antique idea of loyalty. Claire stepped closer. No. Her voice was quiet. He was protecting it from people who confused ownership with permission. Stephen looked at her. Then at the screen behind her, his own voice was already cued in the audio file. Claire pressed play. Daniel is easier than Thomas because Daniel needs to be the man who saves the building. Nobody moved. The recording continued. He thinks this was his idea. Daniel closed his eyes. Stephen did not. Maybe men like him learned early not to look away from disasters they created. When the recording ended, Claire stopped playback. Stephen said nothing. There was nothing left worth saying. Thomas Morgan woke fully 3 days later. Stentui. Claire and Daniel were both beside him. He looked from one child to the other. You two look terrible. Claire laughed. Daniel cried. Not loudly. He simply lowered his head. Thomas looked at him. What happened? Daniel took his father's hand, and this time he waited until Thomas squeezed back. Dad. Yes? I need to tell you something. Claire rose. I'll give you— No. Daniel looked at her. Stay. So she did. Daniel told him everything. The falsified reports, Stephen, Halcyon, Mara, the fingerprint, the threat, the board meeting. He did not soften himself anywhere. Thomas listened. His expression changed only once. When Daniel admitted using his hand, the room went silent afterward. Daniel's voice was barely there. I thought I was saving what you built. Thomas stared at his son, then said, What I built? Daniel nodded. Thomas shook his head. No. He looked at Claire. Then Daniel. I built a company. His voice weakened. You two were supposed to build yourselves. Daniel began crying again. Thomas continued. I spent your entire childhood teaching you that failure was dangerous. He closed his eyes briefly. That was my failure. Dad, let me finish. Daniel stopped. I taught you to win. Thomas opened his eyes. I should have taught you that being wrong won't kill you. Daniel squeezed his father's hand. I was very wrong. Yes. Claire covered a laugh with her hand. Daniel looked offended. Thomas smiled faintly. Your sister has always enjoyed accuracy. Claire leaned over and kissed his forehead. Then Thomas looked toward her. The red file? Found it. Good. The code was Mom's death date. Thomas looked embarrassed. Not very original. It was depressing. It worked. Then he looked toward the door. There was a nurse. Mara. Yes. The one who saw. Claire nodded. I owe her an apology. You do, Daniel said. So do I. Thomas looked at him. Yes. Mara expected the meeting with the Morgans to last 10 minutes. It lasted almost an hour. Thomas apologized first. Not as chairman, not as billionaire, as patient. For whatever happened around my bed while I couldn't speak for myself. Mara nodded. Thank you. Daniel went next. That was harder. I treated your lack of power like permission. Mara looked at him. He didn't look away. I was frightened. That doesn't excuse it. No. I know. You could have cost me my career. I know. My mother depends on me. Daniel swallowed. I know that now. Mara was quiet. Then, I don't forgive you yet. Daniel nodded. You don't have to. That was the correct answer. Claire watched Mara's shoulders lower slightly. Thomas asked what she wanted. Mara frowned. From what? This mess. Nothing. Nothing? I want the hospital to protect nurses who report questionable consent practices, even when the patient's family is powerful. Thomas looked at Claire. Claire smiled. She already drafted something. Mara stared. Claire shrugged. I cope through paperwork, Thomas muttered. She gets that from me. Within 6 months, the hospital adopted a new independent consent review protocol for incapacitated patients involved in significant financial or legal authorization. Mara's name wasn't attached to it. She asked that it not be. That mattered. Daniel stepped down from Morgan Holdings for a year, not because Claire demanded it, because he did. The board appointed an interim executive committee. Stephen Vale was indicted months later alongside 2 directors and executives connected to Halcyon. The attempted transfer was voided. The liquidity crisis disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared once the manipulated contracts were corrected. The company survived. So did Thomas. Longer than the doctors initially expected. He came back to the office only twice. The second time, he removed his name from the executive suite himself. Claire found him standing outside afterward. You okay? No. She smiled. Good answer. He laughed. Your mother would have liked what you've become. Claire swallowed. She would have liked Daniel too. She did. Even now. Especially now. Claire looked through the glass toward her brother. Daniel was sitting in a smaller office. No title on the door. Reviewing compliance reports for a division he once considered beneath him. He's different. Thomas nodded. Consequences are excellent teachers. You sound pleased. I am his father. I can be heartbroken and pleased simultaneously. Claire rested her head briefly against his shoulder. For the first time in years, he didn't talk about work. A year later, Claire walked into the same hospital where the story had started. Not because anyone was dying. Thomas was there for a routine checkup and complaining loudly about parking. Claire found Mara at the nurse's station. You're still here. Mara looked up. Disappointed? No. Claire smiled. Promoted? Mara glanced at the badge clipped beneath her name. Clinical Ethics Liaison. Part-time. Alongside nursing. I hear I have a paperwork-obsessed philanthropist to blame. Sounds awful. It is. They laughed. Daniel appeared at the end of the corridor carrying coffee. Mara's smile faded slightly. Not hatred. History. Daniel stopped several feet away. Morning. Morning. He held up the tray. I brought 4. Mara raised an eyebrow. Why 4? Dad. Claire. Me. He hesitated. And I remembered you take tea. Mara looked at the 4th cup. You remembered? I remember a lot of things I should have noticed earlier. Claire looked between them. Interesting. Mara took the cup. Thank you. Nothing more. No miraculous forgiveness. No instant friendship. Just tea. Sometimes that was enough progress for one morning. Thomas called from his room. Claire, if that doctor tells me to stop eating steak again, I'm changing hospitals. Mara closed her eyes. Your father is impossible. Claire smiled. He's alive. Mara looked toward the room. Yes, he is. And that was the part Claire had nearly forgotten during everything that happened. The company survived. Stephen was exposed. Daniel faced consequences. Her father's signature was restored to being something only he could give. But underneath all of it was something simpler. Thomas Morgan was still there. Still difficult. Still opinionated. Still choosing steak against medical advice. Still her father. Claire had spent most of that terrible week thinking truth would destroy her family. Instead, the lies nearly had. Truth did something different. It removed the version of the family that could only survive if nobody looked closely. What remained was messier. Daniel was no longer the flawless older brother. Thomas was no longer the invincible patriarch. Claire was no longer the daughter who stepped sideways to keep peace. They had all become harder to idealize. And easier to love honestly. Because sometimes betrayal doesn't begin with hatred. Sometimes it begins with fear. With someone saying, I have to fix this. I have to protect them. I have no other choice. And then crossing one line, then another, until protection starts looking exactly like control. Daniel had learned that lesson with his father's unconscious hand inside his own. Claire had learned something else, that noticing the truth isn't the same thing as knowing what to do with it. You still have to decide whether you want revenge or accountability, whether you want someone destroyed or changed, and whether love means protecting people from consequences or standing close enough that they don't have to face those consequences alone. Months later, Thomas asked Claire what she would have done if she'd discovered Daniel had known everything from the beginning. She thought about it for a long time. I don't know. Thomas smiled. That's a better answer than you used to give. Why? Because people who always know what they do usually haven't been tested yet. Claire looked toward Daniel across the garden. He was helping assemble a table Thomas had ordered and refusing to read the instructions. Some things apparently couldn't be redeemed. She laughed. Then her father said, You heard that phone call by accident? Yes. And if the call had disconnected properly? Claire looked at him. The question stayed between them. No investigation, no red file, no boardroom, no exposure. Maybe Stephen would have won. Maybe Daniel would have signed away everything. Maybe Mara would have been punished for telling the truth. Maybe Thomas would have awakened to discover his company belonged to people he'd spent years resisting. All because of one call that had failed to disconnect. Claire looked back at her father. I don't like thinking about that. You should. Why? Thomas watched Daniel struggle with the table. Because most turning points don't announce themselves. Claire smiled. No, they don't. Sometimes they sound like an ordinary phone call. Sometimes they're a sentence you weren't supposed to hear. Sometimes they're a frightened nurse saying, "He was unconscious when someone used his hand." And sometimes, if you're paying attention, one accidental truth is enough to stop an entire family from living inside a lie.